Today we're going to look at a part of God's word in 1 Samuel that you guys could all stand up and tell the story. We could act it out. We could do it a lot of different ways, but we're not going to do that. I believe that God is able to take his word that we think we know hands down and have already mastered, and to bring us new strength, new hope, new understanding through it. I'm not saying that the meaning changes, but as we mature in our faith, God is able to give us deeper understanding of what his word says. And we know that David is a name, we hear it on the news regularly about David's sling. It's a protective thing that Israel has to kind of ward off rockets and stuff as they come in. And it's become almost this David and Goliath thing. It's like people who don't know anything about the Old Testament can probably tell you a little bit about David and Goliath. The thing is that most of them couch this story in a brave little David shepherd boy guy and comes against big, strong Goliath and is the winner. And most people do not have the understanding that it wasn't that David was so brave or so wonderful or so smart or so great with a slingshot. It was that he served the living God and recognized that. And even when we do serve God, we often don't live our lives as though we are his and we have his promises to rely on. And that's really what this is about. Chapter 17 of 1 Samuel starts, the Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Sukkah in Judah and Azekah at Ephes-dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him, carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I'm a Philistine champion, but you're only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. Now remember Saul, he was a tall guy himself, a mighty warrior himself. At one point, Saul, the king of Israel at this time, had the understanding that it was God with him that was making him able to be king. But somehow he lost that and came to a thought that maybe he was the one who was such a great king and he could just go ahead and do things, whether they were what God had asked him or not, whether he had gotten Samuel's permission and he went ahead and offered that sacrifice. And Saul is now at this point in his kingship, he doesn't know it, but he's on his way out. And he no longer has the strength of the Lord in him. He's not relying on God. He's chosen to rely on himself, and he's terrified. And Goliath made quite an impression. His size, his protective armor, his weapons, his weight. And when he bellowed for a challenger to engage him in single combat, really the guy who should have gone out was Saul, the king, the leader of Israel. No one had any trouble hearing him. Anyone could have gone out, but Saul and Israel were both impressed by just how terrifying Goliath was and depressed. Like, how in the world, nobody could stand a chance against this guy. Now, David was the son of a man named Jesse. We've already heard about that, but it sort of reviews it here just to remind us who David is. Remember, he had for a while served Saul as a harp player, a singer to help Saul when he was being troubled by an evil spirit. And apparently that has gotten better, because when we see David here, he's back home. He was a son of Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And Jesse was an old man at that time, and he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shemaiah, were already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem, which shows a willingness on David's part. Remember, he had been anointed by Samuel to be king. He had been called in to help King Saul and was right there in the throne room, so to speak, with Saul, and quite a focus because he was able to calm the king's terrors and anger and just make him able to rule. But now he's willing to also go back and help his elderly father and take care of the sheep. And it would have been easy for him to say, I'm above this, I'm not going back to that. But anyway, for 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. 40 days they heard this, every day for 40 days. One day Jesse said to David, take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers and give them 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report on how they're doing. David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines. But remember, they weren't doing much fighting. They were going out and listening to this Goliath guy terrify them. Anyway, David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks, and then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. Have you seen the giant? The men asked. He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He will give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes. David asked the soldiers standing nearby, what will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? David was really focusing on, this guy is defying Israel and our God. Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he's allowed every day to defy the armies of the living God? Doesn't having a living God make a difference in all this? If God is so identified with Israel, do you think he's indifferent toward this guy's slurs and this slur on his reputation? Do you expect a living God to allow a Philistine to trample his name in military mud? And David recognized that Goliath was not just a big goon from Philistia. Goliath's blabbering dishonored Israel's God. And here again, we're reminded that God does not judge by external appearances. Remember when Samuel was there trying to find which son of Jesse it was that God wanted for the next king of Israel. David was the last to be considered. He's not going to be the one considered appropriate here either. But these men gave David the same reply. Yes, that's the reward for killing him. Obviously, it wasn't enough for people. They thought, oh, we'll never live to get the reward anyway. But when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. What are you doing around here anyway? He demanded. What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle. So Eliab's words dripped with contempt for David. They assumed that David's heart was wrong and that he was here for the wrong reason. And David had to face Eliab, his oldest brother, almost like a Goliath, before he faced the real Goliath, because Eliab, his words were meant to cut David down and to take away any thought he had of following God in this situation, to make David feel like he was just full of himself, which wasn't true. But David answered, soft answer turns away wrath. What have I done now? David replied. I was only asking a question. He walked over to the others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. And then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. The part of his question that was reported is, who is this guy to defy the armies of the Lord? Don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. Remember, they kind of knew one another. I'm sure Saul had never taken much note of David. He was low on the totem pole as a harp player and music. And I'm sure that Saul didn't even recognize that it wasn't David's talent on the harp. It was the fact that the Lord was speaking through him, because Saul had gotten to the point he really wasn't responding to, worshiping, recognizing God. And so when David said, I'll go fight him, it probably seemed like a silly, childish thing. Don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. But David persisted. I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats, he said. When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. So David wasn't pretending he'd been working out so well that he was so strong he could kill bears with his bare hands. He was saying, it's been God who rescued me. And even for us today, I doubt any of us have killed lions or bears, but we have had God rescue us in the past in things that we've prayed about. And sometimes we have trouble remembering that. We are in the moment that we're in, and maybe we need to invest in a diary or a journal to keep track and remember that God has been faithful. And in God's economy, no experience that we have is wasted. Sometimes the things that we go through feel boring and endless and hard and no reward in sight. But God ensures that for his children, the things that we experience are important for us in the future. They remind us of who God is. And David knew that he was rescued not because he had such true grit, but because he knew the true God. Circumstances vary, but God is the same, whether among the sheep or in front of Philistines or in front of a giant like Goliath. And David knew that in his heart. I think if we could teach children or new believers anything, it would be to know that God is true. He's faithful. He does what he says he will do. And he does have our best interests at heart. Saul finally consented. All right, go ahead, he said, and may the Lord be with you. He was like one of those guys who ends up, okay, that sounds terrible, but I'll pray for you. I doubt he did, but he did give him that bit of a blessing. May the Lord be with you. And then Saul gave David his own armor, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. And David put it on, strapped the sword over it, and took a step or two to see what it was like, for he had never worn such things before. I can't go in these, he protested to Saul. I'm not used to them. So David took them off again, and he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at this ruddy-faced boy. "Am I a dog," he roared at David, "that you come at me with a stick?" And he cursed David by the names of his gods. "Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals," Goliath yelled. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David knew from experience that God doesn't save by instruments, by weapons of human power, but through the weakness of his servants, through those who serve him with their whole heart. "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head, and then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Now, David's victory over Goliath clearly was a result of his faith in God that had already been tested and proven in his life. And he had something that we believers all require. He had God-centered thinking. Any problem that he came upon, his first thought was, what does God want to do about this? What does God want to use me to do about this? Is there a role for me in this? But if someone would hear our thoughts and words when we go through dangers and trials and troubles, they might never guess that we had a living God, that we served a living God. We often turn to God only as a last resort after we've tried everything we know how to do and to fix it and to make it better, and then think, okay, God, I can't do anything, so please help. And we really can see things in David's life that really led to David's being able to trust God for triumph over Goliath. David had that deep passion for God that filled his heart with a desire for God's presence. He had joy and security and freedom from anxiety and trusted in God and was grateful to God. And we see those things not just in this narrative, but in the Psalms that he wrote, where he poured out his heart, where he wrote down the prayers that he had for God. And those who constantly pray with an attitude of thanksgiving, all of us can have confidence that God is always with us and will help us in all areas of life. You know, David didn't enjoy having his older brother not be proud of him, think the worst of him, call him out right in front of the rest of his brothers in the army and make him feel bad, call into question his motives. And he could have focused on that piece of this episode and just thought, well, God, I would like to help you, but my brother, he's just such a problem. And Eliab was a problem. And we all have Eliabs in our life, people who are critical and sarcastic and mean and calling against us. And Eliab was just as much of a believer in Jehovah God as David was, but he didn't live it in his life. He didn't count on God to help him. David had also a desire for God's reputation, for his honor. He cared about this guy out there. Every time he insulted the armies of Israel, he was insulting God. And he recognized that Goliath was taunting not really the armies of Israel. He was defying God Almighty. And we run into that day in and day out. We have people who are so sure there is no God, that God is just something that people made up to make themselves feel better, or a myth or a fable or an old wives' tale. We have people who are sure that the power is within human beings to do whatever they want to do, and they're going ahead with all kinds of fancy new inventions and things, defying God and defying the things that are in His Word, in the very lifestyles that they live in the selfish, self-centered way that they go about their work. But David's confidence in God was strong because he had experienced God's rescue through his life, because he had trusted Him and experienced His goodness personally. And really, all the important people regarded David as weak. Remember, his father didn't think David was worth bringing out to introduce to Samuel. And Eliab, his brother, treats him just like he's just a pain, just this little boy who doesn't know what he's doing out here, trying to make us look bad. And Saul had warned David, even though he'd been helpful in his life, singing and calming Saul's terror. He warned David, you're green, you're young, you're inexperienced. There's no way you're going to be able to do this. And Goliath sneered at him when he saw him, this puny little guy. How dare you send him out? But David was the one that God used to deliver Israel. And that's the thing today that we need to remember about this narrative, that it is God who chooses who He will use. And some of the things that He chooses people for are not as showy and not written up and not recognized by others the way David's was, but He still uses people day in, day out who are willing to trust Him. What matters is not whether you have the best weapons. It doesn't matter that you have lots of money. It doesn't matter that you are recognized as talented or that you have a job that seems powerful and something to brag about. It doesn't matter that people recognize even what you do. What matters is that you have the real God, the living God, living within you. And that's where you are today. That's what we need to recognize and stand on and hold on to. His strength shines out brightly behind our weakness. David didn't trust himself, but he trusted God to give him the victory. And the Spirit of the Lord came on David in amazing power, and people were quick to make David a hero. We'll see that as we study more about his life, that was something he struggled with. People wanted to praise David and put him up as a wonderful hero. Wow, look at this guy. They really were not quick to recognize David's weakness, and that it was his strength in the Lord that helped him do what he did. And it wasn't that it was so courageous. It's scary to face a giant, and it was for David too. It was that he recognized that God would be with him. He was concerned about God's reputation enough to risk his own life. Can we say that? As I prayed about this story, I thought, can I say that? Can I say that I'm concerned when people are putting down God and lying about Him and saying Scripture is not true? What is my heart about that? And I recognize that sometimes, silly me, I take it personally, like they're putting me down. They're not putting me down. They're not putting you down. They're putting your God down, just as they were in this piece here that we're looking at. And then our prayer, in our vision, can we see that God's honor is at stake and that we're His representatives here? And there were people in that army of Israel that day who really didn't understand. David's brothers probably were part of that case. Saul certainly was. There were people who had never seen demonstrated the fact that this God they talked about, had learned about, prayed to, offered sacrifices to, worshiped, claimed as their God, had him claimed them as his chosen people, they weren't living like they recognized that he's the living God. He's all powerful. We can trust him. He'll be with us in whatever happens. And he would have been with anyone there. Saul could have redeemed himself to walk out in God's strength and say, God, I'm relying on you to take this guy out. He's defying you. But Saul wasn't that concerned about the reputation of God. He was considered, king of Israel, and he was feeling inadequate. Like, I don't know how to fix this. We're all scared. We don't know what to do with this guy. And never realizing, I am God's chosen. If you have the Lord living in your heart, if you have asked him to be Lord of your life, he's there with you always, doesn't leave you, doesn't forsake you, doesn't just show up when you're having a good prayer day and you're fasting and being a good boy or a girl. He's there with you always. He doesn't leave you. And we, from this piece of David's life, as we're going forward and seeing how this man served God, need to put our story, what's happening to us this week, what we're going to face today, what we're concerned about, what we're scared about, what is troubling us today, and recognize that the God who helped David defeat Goliath, nothing is too hard for God. Nothing is too hard. What becomes the barrier is when we will not believe, we will not trust, we will not give it to God.